All right, hello, and I appreciate you taking the time and consideration to watch this video. My name is Dennis Moore. I teach social studies, specifically advanced placement, world history, and Virginia and United States history at Rockbridge County High School in Lexington, Virginia. Um, Let me first say that I'm recording this using a program called Screencastify, for which I have an individual subscription. So I'm not doing this on school paid for applications or on school paid for equipment. This is all my own individual stuff. So having said that, the purpose for this video is to address some curricular changes that have been made by the Virginia Department of Education within the last year. Specifically, this stuff was developed during the course of 2020 and approved in the fall of 2020. What you're looking at here, specifically, what I'm going to work from to show you some of the things that I'm going to discuss, is a document that summarizes approved changes or changes that were made and then subsequently approved to the standards of learning for social studies curricula at various levels. So the yellow is my highlighting, just so I could easily find and show you some specific examples of some things. The black and red is in the original document, and so the red the red represents things that were changed. You will occasionally see in the black, which is the original language from the 2015 standards, last time they were updated significantly prior to this. You'll see something like here lined out, and these are some things that were to be removed and were removed from the curriculum. So just to validate the source here and show you that this is not, I mean, this is a legitimate thing. So where would you find this if you wanted to see the original source? You would need to go to the VDOE website. You can see that tab up here, and you'll search for. You could probably just search as I did, just Google superintendent's memos, Virginia Department of Education specifically, superintendent's memos, and you'll have to click on 2020, and you look for October 23rd, and you will find memo 286-20. Adoption of the edits from the Governor's Commission on African American History Education. And so you click on that, it'll download it, and that will take you to the memorandum. And that's just a memo. And you would need to go down to attachment H or item H, attachment B. And as it tells you to do, control click and open the link up. And there it is. So this is, a official approved document from within the VDOE, and it shows you the changes again that they made and that were approved. And I have a copy of it here that I've marked up. Now these were adopted, and again I'll show you. So this is from the middle school course, U.S. History to 1865. And if you look, updated December 2020. So we'll find that page again where we were, because we'll come back to that page here in a little bit. And you will see, if you look, if you were to take the time to compare the summary of changes, the document that shows you the summary of changes, if you were to take the time to compare that to the actual existing SOLs, then you would see, indeed those changes have been made. So we're going to reacquire that page where we were, because I'm going to take you back there here shortly. So let's go back here. So I will say right out the gate, I've been teaching for close to 20 years, and I do this because I feel like someone kind of has to set the record straight on some things here, or at least in my view, they do. I do not share my political views with students. I never have. And in fact, I'm so particular about that typically I don't do things like this. I don't put my political views out there. I don't comment on things on Facebook. I don't get into political discussions on social media. Um, I do this with a heavy heart because I feel like it's necessary at this point. Things have changed. I never really thought I'd see the day when the Virginia Department of Education would do some of the things that I'm going to show you in this curriculum. And in my view, and of course, you look at what I've done here. Go look at the documents yourself and make up your own mind. Absolutely, But in my view, this has been politicized, and it's been politicized to reflect kind of left leaning ideological perspective on the narrative of race and racial discrimination, slavery in American history. Now, the caveat to this is not all of it represents that. It doesn't. I mean, a lot of what they've done here is just add layers of detail about those themes, and a lot of stuff. And you've noticed there's only a few things, and I haven't. Not everything that represents this, in my view, have I highlighted. I'm not going to make this into a really really long thing. There are other examples in addition to the ones I'm going to show you here. But a lot of it is not in any sense, really doesn't advance politicization or ideological perspective. But there are some things that are problematic. There are some statements and propositions in here that are problematic, and they're problematic for a variety of different reasons. So we're going to go ahead and pitch into this and show you. So here's an example. First one to discuss, that I've chosen to discuss. You see here the original language. This is from an elementary school standard, the Virginia Studies curriculum, which is taught in elementary school. And so the old standard discussed the first arrival, forcible arrival, obviously, of Africans in early Virginia. And here you have a passage from the old curriculum that's been struck out. And that points out, that the legal status of these people who were brought as permanently, enslaved, folks who were to be permanently enslaved on a chattel basis, versus indentured servants who would serve for a number of years, working on the tobacco fields and then receive freedom and land. Uh, there was a lot of debate about that and a lot of uncertainty over what their status is. That is the case, but this language was removed, and instead here you have language that discusses with the forced arrival of these Africans. Virginia would create a system of people treated as property based on their skin color. And obviously that develops, certainly into the late 17th and into the early 18th century. But this is also true. So it boggles my mind why they would remove that language. It wasn't necessary to remove it. You could have left that in, pointed this out, and you would have had a much more balanced discussion. We'll keep on going until the next yellow block. And again, you can see, I haven't highlighted any of this stuff. I mean, a lot of it is not, in any sense, objectionable. All right. So here we come to, this is US 1, which is part 1 of US history in middle school to 1865. The Declaration of Independence proclaimed independence from Great Britain. It stated that people have natural or inherent rights to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. So this was, the way this was written in the original curriculum. And it goes on to say, in practicality, it only applied to white men at this time. So this statement is problematic. I would classify this as a debatable proposition. Why? In the first place, the Declaration of Independence, I mean, it's a manifesto. It actually doesn't apply specifically to anybody, but that's not really the point here. The Declaration of Independence is just that. It's a statement of principles, of founding principles of the country. And it continued to affect things in a very direct way for a long time. So in the years immediately after the Revolution, through the course of the 1780s, states in the North, states for whom slavery was not an integral part of the economy, implemented emancipation of slaves. Now, this was gradual in most cases. They did not immediately free the enslaved population. But it was phased out, over a period of time, and not a long period of time either in most cases. So certainly for people who were born under those laws, in that next generation of African Americans in the North, these people were free. And this was based on notions of liberty, coming out of the American Revolution and the Enlightenment period, and practically applied. So saying that these ideas only applied to white men at this time, I mean, you could get experts in the room, in this time period, and they would, I'm sure, have a a healthy debate over this. But I think that's demonstrably the case. And if that's the case, then we shouldn't be stating this as fact. It's a debatable proposition stated as fact. We go down here. And we'll go to so here, and these are changes. They don't show you actually the broader standards, and I'm going to show you in some cases, how these fit into the broader standards. And here's an example of that. So, the discussion of the Constitutional Convention, the Three-Fifths Compromise perpetuated slavery in the United States. So let's look at where this fits. So here's the discussion, the broader discussion in that standard of the Constitutional Convention, and there's a lot of conventional stuff, that you would expect. It talks about the convention itself, talks about Washington's role, Madison's role, the large and small states controversy, the three branches, etc. And it gets down to the Three-Fifths Compromise. And what I was looking for was, what else does it say about the Three-Fifths Compromise that wasn't in this document, right? Maybe there's some broader context that I wasn't seeing, and indeed there's not. It simply says the Three-Fifths Compromise perpetuated slavery in the United States. So this is profoundly missing context. What did the Three-Fifths Compromise do? The Three-Fifths Compromise allowed Southern states to count 3/5 of their enslaved population for the purposes of representation in Congress. And this issued forth from the decision to apportion the House of Representatives, the lower house in Congress, by population. So the argument became, okay, is the South going to be able to politically capitalize on this institution of slavery by counting these folks who are chattel property of others, as population, to increase their political power in the House of Representatives? As an extension of that, theoretically, they could do so and enhance that, by the importation of additional people from Africa. And so the Three-Fifths Compromise prevented them, and it was actually paired with an agreement to allow the slave trade to continue until 1808, but then give Congress the authorization to outlaw the slave trade beginning in 1808, which they did, and President Jefferson signed that into law. So if anything, the Three-Fifths Compromise also prevented the Southern states from manipulating this system even further to enhance their own political power. Does it perpetuate in turn? So it acknowledges the existence of slavery, and implicitly, acknowledging, implicitly allows it. I guess you could make that argument, certainly. So it does that, but that's not all it does, and that was not certainly the thrust of that compromise. So this is just, this is really, really badly miscontextualized, and that's all it says. Leaves it there. All right, so we continue on. And this is all middle school stuff, this is kids when they're still fairly young. They're being, to be taught these things. So moving on, same course. Further on, you're getting into discussions of the slave system and the antebellum South. And we have this statement. In the South, white people argued that the Bible sanctioned slavery and the slaveholders acted as Christian protectors of enslaved people. Absolutely, positively, that's a view that you see expressed commonly, especially from very hardcore pro slavery Southern leaders like John C. Calhoun during that period of time. But this is a sensitive issue. It's an issue that historically is very complex. So, as I tell my students, when we oversimplify things, um, we very often kind of back away from an accurate view of what's actually going on. And so, to say that white people, I mean, it does not say all white people. When you just say white people argued this, this is perhaps too broad of a brush, you know, because there are white people in the South during that period of time who were ambivalent about slavery, who were opposed to slavery, some of them for religious reasons. Do they represent a majority of the population? Certainly not, you know. But when we are discussing this issue, I think we do kind of have I don't know, an obligation, to acknowledge these things with kids. This certainly doesn't encourage that. In fact, it seems to do the opposite. So there's only a few more of these. Again, as I'm scrolling through some of these things, if you were to look at them, are a little problematic. A lot of them are not. Okay. So we get to discussion in this. This is still middle school. This is U.S. history, 1865 to present. Essential knowledge, reasons for the Spanish-American War, and again, this is just showing you a part, of the larger standard. There's more stuff in the standard if you were to go here and look it up. But this say, African American troops participated in the Spanish-American War, although their contributions were ignored. An example was the credit the Rough Riders were given in taking San Juan Hill, when it was the 24th Infantry and 9th and 10th Cavalry units that helped to take the hill. Okay. So if that's true in its entirety, right? How do you explain this? So this is a National Park Service website, and it discusses that same content. It discusses service of African American troops in the Spanish American War. And here's an instance landing at Tyabacoa Bay in Cuba. Privates Tompkins, Lee, Bell, Wanton voluntarily went ashore in face of enemy fire. 10th Cavalry, one of the units that was mentioned in the standard, to rescue wounded U.S. and Cuban comrades. After several failed attempts, they succeeded. Each were awarded the Medal of Honor. So that hardly seems to that hardly seems to be an instance in which the contributions of these men were ignored. We have mention of more Medal of Honor winners down here. Now, discussion of San Juan Hill. Rough Rider Frank Knox, and this is the unit that, and certainly they did get more credit, in the American public. I'm not denying that at all. But these guys. And here's a quote from a man in that unit. I never saw braver men anywhere. Lieutenant John J. Pershing. That's Pershing who would command the AEF in World War I. They fought their way into the hearts of the American people. Now, in acknowledgement of what they're talking about, there was discrimination, there was racism, there was a tendency to minimize the role these guys played. Again, it's folly to ignore these or deny these things. But here's an example of the kind of complexity that I was referring to earlier in these issues. Roosevelt says, he's Theodore Roosevelt, commander of the Rough Riders. No one can tell, right, whether it was the Rough Riders or the men of the Ninth who came forward with the greater courage to offer their lives in the service of their country. Then he goes on to make this terrible statement that it discusses here, and you can read that. So it's just, it is nowhere near as simple as they make it seem, in the statement in the curriculum. And then there's this, and this is in the textbook I teach from, and here's a unit of African American soldiers, U.S. colored troops, they were called on dress parade. In some of our brave colored boys who helped to free Cuba. So this narrative that these guys were completely ignored, their contributions were swept under the rug. I understand what they're getting at, but it's just not an accurate statement. Going back here, and there's just a couple more of these, really. So we progress, and here's my course. And so this is Virginia U.S. history. This is 11th grade U.S. history at this point, high school. So I'm much more familiar, with this curriculum, obviously, than I am with the ones I don't teach. And so here's a statement about the colonial period. Private ownership of property characterized colonial life everywhere. So this discussion is intended to address the development, of kind of homegrown American, our artisanal manufacturing, and buying and selling of goods on a free market, you know, and it's just taken to be, kind of teach the students that there's a baseline, for the development of capitalism as an economic system later on. But this, and I find this almost inexplicable. I mean, so private ownership of property characterized colonial life everywhere, although these practices were guided by racism. The practice of ownership included the enslavement of human beings as chattel. Now, that's true, right? The practice of ownership did include the enslavement of human beings as chattel. But does that mean that the practice of ownership of property was guided by racism? Does that mean that the primary manifestation of that is slavery? I don't think so. Why would you? I don't understand. This is again a heavily miscontextualized and oversimplified statement. And we move on to a couple more, and then I'll conclude this. So the next one is an omission. You could quibble over a lot of those statements that I characterized as politicized. A lot of them are debatable propositions. Um, but I don't. What I don't understand is the omissions, or not omissions, but the deletions actually of existing language. African American soldiers in the American Civil War. There is discussion, as there well should be, of their contribution to the Union Army and to Union victory. Um, you see some language here that's been stricken, and it is, and I can verify for you if you were to look, it has been stricken from the new curriculum. It says many fought with distinction, and were eventually paid salaries that were equal to those of white soldiers. So uh, the enlisted soldier, the junior enlisted man in the U.S. Army at that time, got $13 a month. African American soldiers were initially paid $10 a month. So I looked this up, and you can look it up. Obviously, for yourself. So there was like an amended version of the bill that authorized the raising of black troops that was passed. It was sometime in 1864, and it did fix that very discriminatory and unjustifiable discrepancy in pay. Not only did it fix it, but it awarded these guys back pay. Now, whether they actually got the back pay, you'd have to look that up, But the intent was there. Um, why strike this out? It just does not. I don't think there's any. There just is no academic justification for getting rid of this language. You know, when we add or we subtract, we shape. You know, and what we're shaping here is really, really important stuff. It's our children's understanding of history. So, you know, why do this? To me, it's inexplicable. Last thing. Um, So there's discussion of imperialism. There's discussion of the Spanish American War and annexation of the Philippines. So you see here some of the changes that were made. They add in, the theme of racial conflict to that discussion. And there's this statement: the long fight against the Filipinos after the American arrival was often interpreted in the United States as a struggle between white and colored peoples. So I've brought you here to the actual curriculum. You can see that language is in there. Um, I looked to see whether that was contextualized somehow. It talks. There's discussion of the Spanish American War, leading to the United States being recognized as a world power. Um, Puerto Rico annexed. This, eventually leading, to the the seizure of the Canal Zone and the building of the Panama Canal, and the Roosevelt Corollary and other things. Hawaii, Philippines, Guam, the open door policy in China. And then again, they bring in the theme of racial conflict. And this statement is in there. So is this true? Yes. You know, there and I, there's primary sources. I mean, there's a newspaper article I can remember seeing. A woman had written in and said, we want the Philippines, but we don't want the Filipinos. So yeah, sure, it's true. But is it that simple? So the State Department doesn't really think so. Um, if you look at the State Department's website, Office of the Historian, Philippine American War, I'll refer you to that. First of all, there's debate over annexation of the Philippines. You know, did racism come into that debate? Yep, and they acknowledge it. They acknowledge it, in this narrative, but they also acknowledge that this was a complicated debate. There were multiple views coming from a lot of different directions and perspectives. It just once again was not that simple, and so to make that statement the focus of that narrative is it's an oversimplification. So it would appear, and again, this is my view. We're all welcome to our own. That there has been some of these passages are they reflect a very, again, in my view, reflect a very left leaning perspective on the theme, of the themes, I guess, of race and racial discrimination, racism, to include slavery in the earlier part of that, in American history. Um, there's been a lot of discussion about this in current politics, including the Virginia gubernatorial race. And what I hear is, over and over again, the discussion focuses on critical race theory. And I'm not going to comment. I don't feel competent to comment on whether or not these things really constitute critical race theory. To be honest, that's add that to the list of debatable propositions that I've discussed here, I guess. Um, but the problem with focusing in these debates on that is it becomes very easy to focus specifically. So, like, okay, so if the specific characteristics of critical race theory aren't there, if there's no statement, to say that it reflects that, then they're able to say, well, the critical race theory is not being taught. But this glosses over, or I guess it obscures, or takes attention away, distracts from a equally important, probably more important conversation about what is in the new curriculum, and why it's in there and how it was put in there. And to the denial, that these things constitute critical race theory may be totally legitimate. I mean, maybe that's correct in a technical sense. Um, if I'm intellectually honest about it, again, I'm not really sure. But there's a disingenuous element of that. There's sort of a categorical denial. There's an implicit categorical denial in that statement that it's not there at all. That there hasn't been any politicized alteration of curricula. And I think that I've demonstrated here to you, or otherwise I would have made this video, that that's just not the case. I mean, there has definitely been, and it appears to be a deliberate attempt, to politicize the historical narrative that Virginia students learn. So again, make up your own mind. But I think this needed some clarification. Some of this stuff I think needed to see a little more daylight than it's seen in the course of this debate, and I've tried to provide that for you. So hopefully this has helped contribute to your ability to make some decisions about these things in terms of how you feel about it. And again, thank you very much for watching this.